from my understanding, then, Angus Kennedy last week looked at the whole question of what it means to be human in terms of trying to understand what it means to be an individual, what it means to be me, what it means to be you, and to explain that you can't get to grips with that by looking at biology alone. What I want to look at is what does it mean to be human, or what do we have in common in terms of our humanity, and how do we differ from animals? So I'm going to put the case for human exceptionalism, that humans are special, humans are exceptional, but again, so this might be some parallels with what Angus Kennedy was looking at, but I don't think we can turn to biology to tell the full story. So looking to our human genome is not going to be sufficient in terms of understanding human uniqueness. And the reason I think it's really important to put the case for human uniqueness is because we're living at a time where I think it's very fashionable to be anti-human. It's misanthropic political, cultural climate dominates today. And I think generally humanity is seen in a very bad light. So you'll have famous philosophers, scientists, social scientists, novelists, aristocrats, who will go so far as to even call for the mass culling or even elimination of humans. And they can say that on Radio 3, they can write it in our national newspapers, and people don't seem to bat an eyelid. So Orange Prize-winning author Lionel Shriver, she wrote, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, but in one of the national newspapers, commenting on a programme, she said, "If we were to disappear, another form of life will take our place, creatures beautiful, not so self-destructive, or simply weird." That's cheerful news, really. Charming. To me, it's not at all cheerful news. But also John Gray, about a decade ago, he was then Professor of European Thought at the London School of Economics, wrote in his book, Straw Dogs, "Homo rapiens," and that's his play on Homo sapiens, that we are raping the planet, so he calls us Homo rapiens. "Homo rapiens is only one of very many species and not obviously worth preserving. Later or sooner, it will become extinct. When it is gone, the earth will recover." So, oh dear, you know, humans, it might be the end of humans, but we shouldn't, you know, be too bothered about it. Thankfully, I don't think very many people actually go along with the arguments of Lionel Shriver or John Gray in the sense of seeing human beings as a plague in that sense. They talk about human beings as a pest, and others talk about human beings as a bacteria. We're destructive, we're not worth preserving. I think if you did really adopt that anti-human, misanthropic, nihilistic worldview, then really what's the point in living? Surely, if that's the view you had, then the right thing to do would be to work out how you could kill yourself and take as many people as possible with you. But I think even though many would, ultimately, if push comes to shove, they would reject the extreme version of anti-humanism. I still think very many more go along with this view that animals are ultimately not that different from human beings, or human beings are not that different from other animals. And to me, the effect is the same in the sense of a denigration of human abilities and human achievements. So I very much want to emphasize the qualitative difference between animals, all animals, and humans. And when I started writing this book, Just Another Ape, I sort of anticipated that maybe an analysis of ape capabilities, looking at what apes might know about the world, what they're capable of, I thought they might shed some light on how human beings came to be. So after all, we split from the ape line about 6 million years ago, which is not at all long in evolutionary terms. We share 98% of our genetic makeup with chimpanzees, which is almost the same as horses and zebras, or mice and rats. So I thought, well, it may be plausible we really understood what do apes know, what do they, the nature of ape communications, for instance, it might give us some insight into the seeds, the origins of our unique human capabilities. But the more I looked at all of the studies, the more I was struck by how far apart we are. And I would like to stress that sharing 98% of our genetic makeup with apes does not in any way mean that we are 98% ape-like or apes are 98% human-like. We also share 60 to 70% of our DNA with goldfish and 50% of our DNA with bananas. So it would be meaningless if I was to say, well, you know, I think we are 50%, or bananas are 50% human-like, or we are 60 to 70% goldfish-like. We are the product of evolution, like all other animals, but what sets us apart is culture. That we have culture and no other animal has culture. And so the thing that sets us apart is our capacity for cultural transmission, our capacity to learn from each other. It's the connection between human minds that sets us apart, a connection that you find amongst humans that you don't find amongst any other animals. So something amazing emerged, came about 60, 50 or 40,000 years ago, that transformed us, and that was this capacity for cultural transmission. So there must have been some kind of chance mutation or a number of chance mutations that allowed us at that point in the past to start learning from each other in a qualitatively new way. And as a result, we were able to learn from our fellows, build on the achievements of our fellows, work cooperatively, and build on the achievements of previous generations. So what you see then is that learning becomes cumulative. And you don't see that amongst any animal. And so ultimately, we become so much more than the sum of our parts. Humanity as a whole becomes so much more than the sum of our parts. And the reason I started thinking, well, maybe we can't learn that much about what it was that brought about this change. I can't give an explanation for what happened 60 to 50 to 40,000 years ago that brought about the change. Human brain size alone cannot explain it. I mean, the brain of Homo sapiens by 200,000 years ago was 3 times the size of apes. But then it took tens of thousands of years before anything dramatic happened. So as Jared Diamond says, for much of the 6 million years after our lineage diverged from our common ape ancestors, we remained not that different, not that much more than glorified chimpanzees in terms of how we lived and the types of tools that we used. So we were still sort of chipping away. We could use tools to make tools, but it was basically chipping away at stones to make sharp things, to kill animals, and to, what do you call it when you get the fur off the animals? Skin an animal, yes. You use tools to skin an animal. That's what, from 6 million years ago, even after the modern brain emerged 200,000 years ago, we're tens of thousands of years after that, we were still very much like glorified chimpanzees. And then something dramatic happens, and then in the space of between 50 and 30,000 years ago, you then see the emergence of cave paintings. So if you have cave paintings, you have symbolic thinking. You see far more sophisticated tool use. You see more developed hunting techniques. You find ceremonial burials and even travel across oceans. So you go from making simple tools to traveling across oceans. And that happened in the space of a few tens of thousands of years. Some people refer to this as the period of cultural takeoff. So basically, you know, we're just coasting along, and then you see this sudden cultural takeoff with more and more innovations and fundamental changes in how we're living and how far we can travel and such like. And once we've taken off, then we can fly higher and higher. The cognitive archaeologist Stephen Mythen argues in The Prehistory of the Mind, he says, with the birth of agriculture and the domestication of animals around 10,000 years ago, events have flashed past at a bewildering speed. People create towns, then cities, in no more than an instant, and it is an instant if you think about from 6 million years ago to what's happened in, you know, in the last thousands of years. In no more than an instant, then carts become cars, writing tablets become word processors, he says, and now word processors become tablets. And in his 1876 pamphlet, The Part Played by Labour in the Transition from Ape to Man, Karl Marx's collaborator Friedrich Engels argued that each generation has been able to build on the abilities of previous generations, and with the work of each generation becoming different, more perfect, more diversified. So he says, agriculture is added to hunting and cattle raising, then came spinning, then weaving, then metalworking, pottery, navigation. Along with trade and industry, art and science finally appeared. I've travelled up from Birmingham to Leeds today. Just a few hundred years ago, it would have taken days to just get a message from Birmingham to Leeds, or the distance that it is from Birmingham to Leeds. Today, we can communicate with almost anybody, almost anywhere in the world, instantaneously. And today, I think, you can travel around the world quicker than it would have taken people a few hundred years ago to get from Birmingham to Leeds. Going back to apes, their life has hardly changed in the 6 million years since our lines diverged. They still live in the same hand-to-mouth existence as they did then. And this, I would argue, is because they don't have this capacity for cultural learning or cultural transmission. So the type of learning where you can learn from the innovations of somebody else and then maybe build upon that so that the learning becomes cumulative. And so it requires a more sophisticated type of social learning. So I would argue that animals don't have social learning. Now, it all depends on what terminology you use, because they do have some more simple form of learning that you find amongst animals. So rat pups, for instance, only eat what their mother eats. So there's some learning there, and that makes evolutionary sense, that they would only eat what their mother would eat. Young birds learn species-typical songs through mimicry. And one example that somebody sort of threw back at me before when I was saying animals aren't able to learn from each other is, oh, well, what about in the 1930s, you found people who were leaving out their milk bottles, that this spread amongst tits in England, that one learnt that what you can do is peel off the silver foil off the milk bottle to drink the cream at the top, and it spread like wildfire. So that seems to indicate that, oh, maybe birds can learn from each other. However, I think what's really important is when you look at animal behaviour, you have to question your assumptions and question, well, is this imitation in the way that you're talking about humans being able to imitate? And a clever experiment was carried out with ticks in a cage where half of them would have the milk bottle in their cage with the foil on, and the other half would have the milk bottle in their cage, and next to them would be another cage with a bird that had learnt to peel off the silver foil. Now, you would think, statistically then, if you worked out how quickly they worked out how to peel the silver foil off the milk bottle, that if there was any kind of learning in terms of imitation in the way that humans learn, then who would be the fastest in peeling the foil off? The ones who could see the other bird peeling it off, or the ones who just had the milk bottle? Any thoughts? Yeah, you would have thought that, but actually there was no difference. So, because this is what some ethologists who research animal behaviour said, is that this isn't imitation, it's stimulus enhancement. It's basically, they've learnt, and it makes sense evolutionary, that if their attention is drawn to where other birds are, and if other birds are going for feeding places, then their attention's just drawn to the bottle. And then they have to learn their own way of doing it. And species-specific behaviour is peeling bark off trees in order to get at food. So they learnt it themselves just by the attention being drawn to the bottle. So I want to look at imitation, which is one of the simpler forms of cultural learning that humans have. Although it's a simpler form of cultural learning, cooperative learning and teaching, I think, is more complex. It's still cognitively more complex than people thought before, in the sense that you have to look at somebody doing something and then you have to think about what it means for you yourself to do it. So you have to put yourself in another person's shoe. And all the research that I've looked at in relation to apes and whether apes can imitate shows that actually the great apes, chimpanzees, orangutans and gorillas, cannot ape. The two people who sort of led research teams who've done the most interesting work around comparing humans and animals are Daniel Pavanelli in the States, although he no longer runs the Cognitive Evolution Group. But the Cognitive Evolution Group at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, he's carried out loads of research comparing children and apes and humans and apes. And also Michael Tomasello at the Leipzig, Wolfgang Köhler Center in Leipzig in Germany. But what Pavanelli showed, that he's various interesting experiments he's carried out. One was where he shows apes, somebody managing to retrieve, there's a cloth and there's a banana lying on top of the cloth, or nuts, or whatever the ape would like as a reward. And so they can see somebody pulling that cloth, because it's out of reach. The reward is out of reach and it's lying on top of the cloth. Pulling the cloth and then managing to reach the reward. So he wanted to see, well, can apes realise that a cloth could be used as a tool? And so he, in some of them, the cloth was lying, banana, let's say if it was a banana, was touching the cloth but not on top of the cloth. And in another one, the banana would be lying on top of the cloth. And he found it was 50-50 whether they'd go for pulling the cloth that the banana's lying on top of or pulling the cloth that the banana's just touching. So what he says is that the way that apes learn is that they basically learn that a tool can work, but they don't learn how a tool can work. They don't have the capacity to think about, how did they get that? You know, they pulled the cloth and they got their banana. How did they do it? Well, it must be to do with the banana lying on, you know, and understanding it anyway. They don't understand how, they just understand that it works. Similarly, there was, he had a rake lying in the cage. What he found was that if there was a rake in the cage and there were various out-of-reach rewards, the chimpanzee might not work out for themselves that they could use that rake to try and get at the out-of-reach rewards. If they saw their trainer or some other person in another cage using the rake to get at the reward, then they did use the rake. So it's slightly more sophisticated than the tits who their attention was just drawn to something. They understood that, oh, a rake can be a tool. But they would then not use the rake in the way that, if you were going to use a rake to get a reward, you would turn it upside down, wouldn't you, so that it was like a T-bar, so you could pull the rewards towards you. They might use the wrong way round, and it wouldn't work, or with the prongs sticking down rather than up. So they're not able to copy with any degree of fidelity. They just seem to understand that a tool works, and then by trial and error they have to work out their own way of using that tool. So they might end up using it the same way, or they might end up getting a different result and using it differently. So that's why, and I would argue that a really, really, really clever ape, the cleverest ape of all the apes that have ever existed, may be able to invent all of the clever inventions that apes have made in the wild, in the history of ape life. And there aren't that many clever inventions in terms of primatologists have come up with, but there are some, like using sticks to stick fish for termites, sticking them in the termite nest and then eating them, or using leaves as cover from rain or to wash food or whatever. But a clever ape foreseeably could invent every invention an ape has ever, any ape in the history of apeness has ever invented. It is absolutely inconceivable that any human being, however clever they are, could invent from scratch every human invention. Even if you just take something like the bike and say, could a human from scratch invent a bicycle? No, you'd have to invent the wheel, rubber, you know, everything that cogs, gears. It's inconceivable that humans could invent bicycles, x-rays, the harnessing of electricity, iPhones. It's just trains, impossible. And that is because we build upon the achievements of previous generations, and apes don't. Now, just to look at children, if you look at children, even children of 1 year of age are head and shoulders above any ape in terms of the flexibility with which they are able to imitate. So I would argue quite categorically. I know there is disagreement among some primatologists. Some claim apes can imitate, but I think Povinelli and Tomasello, with the research they've done, have shown apes cannot imitate. They can emulate in the sense that all they learn is the tool can work, but they can't imitate with any fidelity at all. Whilst children can imitate, even at 1 year of age, with great flexibility. So they've shown that young children, even 1 year of age, can imitate sequence of actions with great fidelity, so the exact sequence of actions in order to get an outcome. They can also imitate a goal, so if the experimenters basically they've got a stick to fish for something, and so they're showing them this stick and they go, and when they drop it, oh, it didn't work. Yeah, they then give the stick to the child. So the child is imitating what the experimenter did, but understood the goal. The goal was to fish something up, and they then go in and fish it out. So they can imitate the goal, or they could. They've shown 18 months old that they can think about the intention. So one experiment that was carried out is that they would see an adult. First of all, let's say I've got my cardigan on. They see an adult, and I have to hold on to this because otherwise it's falling off. Walk over, because it's dark, and then turn the light on with their nose. And I stick the light on like that. And then in another situation, they see an adult just walking over and turning the light on with their nose. If the adult, this is 18 months old, if the adult had this round their neck and was holding on to it, what they did, they went up and they turned it on with their finger. If the adult wasn't holding anything but went over, and it's like you're deliberately, I have chosen to do it with my nose and turn it on with their nose, then they did it with their nose. So they have the capacity to think about why you did what you did as well. So it shows there's a world of difference between the nature of children's imitation and ape imitation. They can imitate with great flexibility, and they are like young children, they are like imitation machines. They seem to get great enjoyment out of imitating. One example, I don't know how I'm doing for time, whether I should give this.
Yeah, you've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes, oh right, okay. No, just one example I found it so amusing at the time was my brother's son has got, in Norway, has got quite severe learning difficulties, and he gets very excited about Bob the Builder. Big Mr. Bob, it's called in Norwegian. And I was there once, and I was saying to Magnus, well, I'll put on Big Mr. Bob for you. And he gets so excited, and he has this ritual when you put it on. First of all, he's flapping his hands, and then when it comes on the telly, he can't just sit down and watch it because he's so excited. He runs up and he puts his face right in the television. He runs back, and eventually he sort of sits down and watches it. And so I'm saying to Magnus, I'm going to put on Big Mr. Bob. Casper, his little brother at the time, was 18 months old. I put it on, and then turn around. Oh, Magnus is gone. In comes Casper, and he comes running in, and he stands there, and he stops, and he goes like this, and he runs up to the screen, he sticks his nose, and he goes through the whole ritual. So he must have thought, because he never did that when I put anything else on, as an 18-month-old, he must have thought that's what you do when Bob the Builder comes on. But it's like they get enjoyment out of imitating. So try very briefly then look at why it could be that humans have this capacity that for imitative learning that apes don't have. And it must mean that something must have happened in our evolution that we have this capacity that apes don't have, because otherwise if you decided to raise an ape as a human, if it wasn't that there's something in our genetic makeup that is unique, then you should be able to say, right, okay, I'm going to raise an ape as a human and they'll become human. Now, there's a number of people who've tried that and been very disappointed in the results. It just hasn't worked. So humans have got something. And one theory, I think there's a lot of interesting work that's going on with the developmental psychology looking at this. One theory is that our unique abilities come out of our very early innate desire to connect with other humans emotionally. So if you look at very young infants, they engage in, just a few weeks old, they engage in what's some developmental psychologists called proto-conversations. So it's like they're having a conversation and an engagement with you, but there's no language there. All it is it's at the level of emotion. And children will become quite distressed if there's any kind of breakdown in that engagement. Or if it's out of sync. So there are experiments carried out where the mother is engaging, but what they've done is put a delay on it. So there's a 2-second delay between what the infant's doing and what the mother's doing. The infant picks up on it and gets really distressed and starts crying. So there could be this innate emotional desire to engage with other human beings, which at round about 9 months of age becomes a way in which two beings are engaging about something else. So it's like a triangle. You're emotionally engaging with an adult about the outside world. So humans will pick up emotionally on the reaction of adults before they approach something, for instance, and they start following eye gaze. So, if you look at a 9-month-old and then you suddenly look over, start staring, they would turn around. And no animal does that. Follow your eye gaze. And that's when you see the emergence of what's called proto-declarative pointing. They point just out of interest. So a baby might point at airplane in the sky, and then you go, oh yes, airplane. And the joy that you are both emotionally engaging about something else. So there's lots of interesting work going on that this could be the basis on which we are able then to develop language, because those innate emotional engagements become transformed into more conscious exchanges of feelings and desires and views and beliefs. So in a fascinating book called The Cradle of Thought, Exploring the Origins of Thinking, Peter Hobson, who's a developmental psychopathologist, he says that when children start pointing, he says, this is the beginning of a revolution, because at the beginning, the infant does not know in an intellectual way that the world has meaning for others. The discovery is a discovery in action and feelings rather than a discovery in thoughts. And out of these early emotional engagement, then language develops. And Hobson says, and at this point, the child leaves infancy behind. Empowered by language and other forms of symbolic functioning, she takes off in the realm of culture. The infant has been lifted out of the cradle of thought, because the emotional engagement, he says, is the cradle of thought. So the infant's been lifted out of the cradle of thought, and engagement with others has taught this soul how to fly. So you would have thought then, if that is one of the unique things, is that emotional engagement, then you might think that if you look at infant and toddler abilities and compare them to apes, there might be a time in the development of the individual that they might, in terms of their understanding of the physical world, knowledge of the physical world, they might not be that distinct from apes, but in terms of their social cognition, they might already have started developing unique, distinctly human characteristics. And at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, they gave a battery of tests to chimpanzees, orangutans, and human children under 2 years of age. And they did find that those children had similar levels to the chimpanzees on tasks of physical cognition, so judging things like space, quantities, and understanding causality. There was not a world of a difference between the children and the chimpanzees. The orangutans are not as clever as the chimpanzees. But the human children outstripped the chimpanzees and the orangutans on tasks of social cognition. So if it was trying to solve a problem by observing somebody else, or showing an understanding of the intentions of others, or finding a hidden reward by picking up on communication signals from somebody else. So to conclude then, we are unique because we have this motivation, I think, to engage with each other, and that could be the basis on which language developed. And language, in turn, transforms the way in which we can learn from each other, the extent to which we can cooperate, teach each other and learn from each other, so that our learning becomes even more powerful. So all of our achievements are as a result of us putting our heads together, rather than what we can achieve on our own. And so with that, we have created culture, and we have created civilization, and that is something to celebrate. And if, for John Gray and Susan Blackmore and Lionel Shriver and David Attenborough and all those people who seem to think like, oh, so what if humans disappeared? Well, if humans disappeared, culture would be gone, civilization would be gone, something unique would disappear. So I would argue it would be a crying shame. It's terrifying to me, and we should celebrate our achievement, and we should celebrate civilization, and we should celebrate culture. That's not to say, oh, humans are all good. Of course, you look at the 20th century, there's lots of evidence of human destructiveness. We aren't perfect, and we never will be perfect, but I think we have the capacity to be so much better than what we can be on our own. We have the capacity to look at ourselves and think about how to make ourselves better, and we have the capacity to think about how we work together as humans and what kind of society we would want, discuss that and fight for that. So it would be a crying shame if we lose sight of that unique capacity, I think, that we have.
Thank you very much.